Suzanne Morphew had always been a picture of serenity. Her mornings began with the gentle chirping of birds outside her window. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as she slowly woke up. The warm sun rays peeked through the curtains, casting soft golden light. But that morning was different. It was a strange, almost unsettling quiet. The house felt empty. The silence lingered longer than usual. She stepped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. Her eyes scanned the room, but something felt off. The usual warmth of the house was gone. Her husband, Barry, was nowhere in sight. She called out his name, but there was no reply. Her heart began to race. Why was it so quiet? Her mind tried to piece things together, but confusion settled in. Had she missed something? The clock on the wall ticked louder than before, each second stretching longer. She grabbed her robe and hurried downstairs. The kitchen was still, the coffee pot cold. Nothing seemed out of place, but the tension was thick. She opened the door to the garage. Barry's car was gone. She felt a pang in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Maybe he was just running errands. Her breath hitched as she reached for her phone. She dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Susan tried not to panic. Maybe he was busy. But with each passing minute, unease crept in. She paced the living room, unable to sit still. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken worry. The phone in her hand vibrated, breaking the silence. A message from Barry. She opened it, her fingers trembling. The message read, "I'm sorry." That was it. Nothing else. Her pulse quickened, her stomach twisted. She stared at the screen in disbelief. Where was he? What did he mean by, "I'm sorry"? The words echoed in her mind, each repetition making her heart race faster. She went outside, hoping to spot his car on the street. Nothing. Just empty roads and the endless, quiet landscape. The panic was starting to set in. What was happening? Suzanne turned to go back inside, but then she froze. A car pulled into the driveway. Her heart leaped with hope. Could it be Barry? The car stopped. The engine shut off. Suzanne held her breath, waiting. But the door didn't open. No familiar footsteps. No sound of Barry's voice. A man stepped out, but it wasn't Barry. It was someone she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. Who was he? What was going on? The man walked toward the house, his face unreadable. Suzanne's mind raced. Who was he? Where was Barry? Was he in danger? The man stopped at the door, then knocked. Each knock felt like a hammer to her chest. Her legs felt weak as she walked toward the door. The moment she opened it, the man's cold gaze met hers. He introduced himself, but the words didn't register. She was too shocked to hear him. He didn't belong here. Not in her home. Not in her life. Her mind swirled in confusion. Then the man spoke again, his voice like ice. "We have to talk about your husband." Her heart skipped a beat. What had happened? What was going on? She stepped back instinctively. As her world crumbled around her, the man's presence felt suffocating. His words hit her like a cold wave. Her pulse thudded in her ears. "Where is Barry?" Susan finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. The man's expression didn't change. He took a deep breath, then spoke slowly, as if weighing every word. "I'm afraid your husband, he's not coming back." The words hung in the air, like a storm about to break. Her heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" Suzanne's voice cracked. The man stepped closer, his face somber, almost apologetic. "There's been an incident," he said. "I'm sorry to tell you, but Barry's been involved in something." Suzanne felt the world shift beneath her feet. "Something?" she repeated, her eyes wide with confusion. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. What was he saying? What had happened to Barry? The man hesitated, then looked at her with pity in his eyes. "It's better if you come with me," he said quietly. "We need to explain everything." Suzanne didn't know what to think. Her legs felt weak, but she couldn't stop herself from moving. She followed the man, each step heavier than the last. The chill of fear wrapped itself around her. Her thoughts scattered, trying to grasp what was happening. They reached his car, parked at the end of the driveway. She couldn't breathe as she got in, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The silence in the car was unbearable. The man drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The air felt thick with unspoken truths. Suzanne's mind raced, spinning with questions, doubts, and fears. What could have happened to Barry? Where was he? Why hadn't he come home? Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, but there were no answers there. The man finally broke the silence. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low. Suzanne nodded, but her heart pounded louder with each passing second. What was she about to learn? What had Barry done? The car turned down a narrow road, surrounded by trees that loomed like dark shadows. It felt like they were entering a place where no one would hear her screams. Her stomach twisted, and a cold sweat began to form on her brow. They stopped in front of a large, imposing building, a warehouse of sorts. The man turned off the engine and got out of the car without a word. Suzanne hesitated, but then followed him, her heart thumping wildly. What was this place? Why had they come here? She couldn't shake the sense that she was stepping into something dark, something she wasn't ready to face. The man led her inside, where the air smelled musty and damp. There were shadows everywhere. Suzanne's breath quickened. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing familiar here. Then the man stopped. He turned to face her. "It's time," he said, his voice grave. Suzanne's stomach dropped. Time for what? Her eyes locked onto his, searching for answers. But the man remained silent. And in that moment, Suzanne knew, with horrifying clarity, she was about to uncover something she was never meant to know. The silence was deafening. Suzanne's heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The man motioned for her to follow him down a narrow corridor. Each step echoed, amplifying the growing dread in her gut. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her legs refused to listen. She had to know. She had to understand what was happening to Barry. They reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was heavy, old, and covered in grime. The man pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges cutting through the tension. Inside was dimly lit, the only source of light a flickering bulb overhead. Suzanne's eyes adjusted to the darkness. And there, in the center of the room, was a table. On the table, there was a stack of papers. At first, Suzanne thought they were just documents, nothing more. But as her eyes focused, her stomach churned. These weren't just papers. They were photos. Photos of Barry. Barry in places she had never seen. Barry with people she didn't recognize. Her throat went dry as she took a step closer. The man followed her, his shadow looming behind her. Her hands shook as she picked up one of the photos. There was Barry, but something about his face was different. It was cold, detached, as if he was someone else entirely. The man cleared his throat. Suzanne's eyes darted to him, panic rising in her chest. "Where is he?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. The man didn't answer right away. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Barry's been living a lie." Suzanne's mind raced. What did he mean? What was he talking about? The man continued, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "The person you thought you knew isn't the person he is." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her body swayed as she fought to stay upright. No, this couldn't be real. Not Barry. Not the man she loved. "You're lying," Suzanne finally managed to say, her voice shaking. The man didn't respond, but he didn't have to. His silence was the answer. He watched her, waiting for her to process the truth. But the truth was too much. Too overwhelming. Suzanne's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. The cold concrete against her skin only intensified the shock. Her mind was a blur, struggling to piece the fragments of reality together. She stared at the photos scattered on the table, each one more damning than the last. There were pictures of Barry in places he had no reason to be, with people she didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat as the horror began to sink in. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would he do this?" The man took a deep breath. "I'm afraid Barry's involved in something much bigger than you realize," he said. "Something dangerous." Suzanne's hands gripped the edges of the table as she tried to steady herself. But everything inside her was shaking. This couldn't be true. Not Barry. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There are things in his past that have caught up with him. Things he didn't want you to know." Her heart twisted. Barry had been hiding something, something he couldn't escape. The man's eyes darkened. And now, Suzanne, it's your turn to face the truth. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. The truth. What truth? Her mind scrambled to understand. And then, as if everything around her had been building to this moment, the man spoke again. The man you love is no longer the man you knew. Suzanne's breath caught in her throat. The man's words rang in her ears, reverberating through her mind. No longer the man you knew. What did he mean? Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached for another photo. This one was different. It wasn't just Barry. It was a much darker side of him. The photo showed him with another woman. Her face was partially obscured, but the message was clear. Barry wasn't just involved in something shady. He was part of something far worse. Suzanne's heart hammered in her chest. Who was he? Who was the man she had married? The man stepped back, giving her space, yet his presence still loomed over her. She felt trapped in the room, suffocating under the weight of the revelations. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She needed to understand. Tell me what happened, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The man's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then he took a deep breath and began. There was a time a long time ago when Barry wasn't just the man you saw every day. He was involved in a much darker world. Criminals, lies, secrets. Suzanne's mind was spinning. Her legs felt like jelly, but she stayed standing, forcing herself to listen. You see, Barry wasn't just a simple husband. He had debts. He owed people things that he couldn't pay back. Dangerous people. Her stomach churned at the words. But she didn't turn away. She had to know the truth. The man continued, his voice low and grave. One thing led to another, and he got pulled deeper. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to survive. But it never stopped. It grew. Suzanne's head swam with disbelief. Barry, her Barry, had been involved in something illegal? Something so dangerous? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog, but the reality was settling in. And then there was that night, the man said, his tone becoming more serious. Suzanne froze, her breath catching. What night? She asked, her voice trembling. The man's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. The night that changed everything. Suzanne's heart stopped. She felt as if the floor had just been pulled from beneath her. Barry had changed? But how? She couldn't imagine him ever being part of something this dark. The man's next words hit like a thunderclap. Barry made a choice. A decision that couldn't be undone. And now, people are coming after him. And after you. Suzanne's world tilted as she struggled to comprehend what he was saying. What had Barry done? What had he gotten her into? Barry wasn't just in danger. He had betrayed the wrong people. And they didn't forget. Her head spun. The betrayal. The lies. Everything she thought she knew about her husband. Her chest felt tight, as if she couldn't breathe. No, she whispered, barely able to speak. The man stepped back, letting the weight of his words sink in. There's more, but it's too late. Too late for him. And for you, Suzanne. Susan felt as if the room was closing in on her. The air was thick, suffocating. Her thoughts were scattered, desperate to understand what had just been revealed. Her mind kept circling back to one question. Why didn't he tell me? The man's face was impassive as he looked at her, his eyes hard. You'll never be safe. Not now. Not with the truth you know. The words echoed in her head. And with each passing second, the room grew darker. Suzanne's mind was reeling, her world spinning out of control. The man's words seemed to smother her, making it hard to breathe, let alone think. Never be safe. The truth. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, trying to steady herself. Her thoughts were fragmented, as if trying to piece together shattered glass. She had loved Barry, trusted him, had built her life around him. And now everything was crumbling. She looked up at the man, searching his face for some shred of compassion, something that could explain why he had brought her here. But there was nothing, just cold indifference. Where is he? Suzanne asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't immediately respond, his gaze fixed on the floor as if deliberating. Then he looked at her, his expression hardening. He's gone, he said simply. And you need to leave. Now. Suzanne's heart dropped. Gone? What did that mean? Gone? You mean dead? She managed, her voice catching in her throat. The man nodded slowly, but didn't say another word. Her stomach churned at the implication. Barry, her Barry, wasn't coming back. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not let this man see her break down. I don't believe you, she said, her voice shaking, but filled with defiance. I don't believe any of this. But deep down, her gut told her it was true. She had been living a lie. Barry was gone, and she had no idea where he was or what had happened to him. And now, she was left with nothing but pieces of a life that had never been real. The man took a step back, his eyes narrowing. You'll have to believe it, because people like him, people like Barry, don't just disappear without a trace. And now, you're in danger, Suzanne. Her blood ran cold at his words. She felt a wave of panic rise within her. Danger? She shook her head, struggling to understand. Who's after me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes flickered to the door. You don't want to know. But if you stay here, you'll be dragged into something darker than you can imagine. Something that won't let you go. The weight of his warning settled over her like a heavy blanket. She turned toward the door, her body tense, every instinct screaming at her to get out. As she moved toward the exit, she glanced back one last time. The man didn't follow her. He just stood there, watching her with that same cold, unreadable gaze. She pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts racing. The darkness of the night felt overwhelming, suffocating. Her mind kept replaying the words of the man. Barry made a choice. And now, people are coming after you, But where would she go? How could she escape this nightmare that had become her life? Her legs shook as she stumbled away from the warehouse, her body moving on autopilot. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing in on her, suffocating her. There was no turning back now. Not from this. Not from what Barry had done. The only thing left was to survive. But who could she trust? Who could she turn to now? As she walked into the dark night, the wind howled, carrying with it an overwhelming sense of doom. She knew then, as she looked back one last time at the warehouse fading in the distance, that her life would never be the same again. And the truth, that unbearable truth, was only the beginning of what was to come. Suzanne's footsteps were uneven, her body heavy with the weight of the unknown. The world around her felt unreal, distorted by the harsh reality that had just been thrust upon her. She couldn't escape the images of Barry, the man she thought she knew, haunting her thoughts. Gone. Dead. A liar. Each word echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. She couldn't think straight. Every step felt like it was leading her deeper into a nightmare. She needed answers, but all she had were more questions. What had Barry done? What had he gotten himself into? And why had she been kept in the dark? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands slick with sweat. The screen lit up, revealing an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. It could be someone from Barry's life, someone who knew more than she did. With trembling fingers, she answered. Hello. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end, then a voice she didn't recognize spoke. You're in danger, Suzanne. Her heart froze. The voice was low and urgent, filled with an edge of fear. She didn't speak at first, waiting for the voice to continue. We know about you. We know everything, the voice continued, sending a chill down her spine. Suzanne's mind raced. Who was this? Who was threatening her now? Who is this? She managed to ask, her voice trembling. Does it matter? The voice replied, the words dripping with menace. What matters is that you need to get out. Now. Leave your home. Don't trust anyone. Not even the police. Her mind was spinning. She didn't know whether to hang up or listen. But deep down, she knew this wasn't a warning she could ignore. The voice paused again, as if calculating how much to say. There's more to Barry's story than you think. He wasn't just involved. He was the one pulling the strings. But now, Suzanne, he's gone, and they're coming for anyone who's been close to him. Her breath hitched. Barry had been the one pulling the strings? Her whole world seemed to shatter with those words. "Who's coming for me?" Suzanne asked, her voice barely a whisper now, as the full weight of her fear began to sink in. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, there was the sound of a rustling, as if the person on the other end was shifting uncomfortably. "You don't want to know, but it's too late now," the voice said. "They'll be watching. Always watching." A sudden, sharp click signaled the end of the call. Suzanne stood frozen, staring at the screen, her heart thumping in her chest. Her hand shook as she lowered the phone. The air around her felt suffocating, like it was closing in on her. She could feel eyes on her. Someone was out there. Someone was waiting, asterisk. A sound in the distance caught her attention. The faint hum of a car engine in the night. It was getting closer. Her stomach dropped. She had to move. Without thinking, she turned and began walking faster, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every sound amplified. The night had turned into a menacing void, closing in around her with each step. As she turned a corner, she saw a car approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The car slowed as it neared her, and Suzanne's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't stop herself from looking back at it. Could it be them? The people from the phone call? Or was it just a coincidence? The car stopped a few feet away, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the window rolled down, and a man's voice called out to her from inside. "Suzanne, get in. It's not safe out here." Her heart leaped in her throat. She couldn't trust anyone. She knew that now. But the desperation in his voice, the urgency, made her hesitate. What if he was the only one who could help her? But she also knew, deep down, that it was too late to make any safe choices. Suzanne stood there, caught between the man in the car and the darkness that loomed ahead. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to trust no one, especially not someone who seemed to appear out of nowhere. But the urgency in his voice, the pleading edge, tugged at something deep inside her. She glanced over her shoulder, the night stretching endlessly in both directions. There was nowhere to hide. Her breath caught as the weight of the decision pressed down on her. If she didn't get in the car, what would happen next? The people from the phone call? The ones watching her? "Please, Suzanne," the man urged, his voice softer now, but still intense. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you. You're in danger. You need to come with me." Her mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. Who was he? Could she trust him? But then another thought flickered through her mind. Barry. The man had said it wasn't just Barry. It was something bigger. Much bigger. If she could learn what Barry had been involved in, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of this nightmare. Slowly, as if every muscle in her body was screaming at her to run, she took a step toward the car. Her hand hovered above the door handle. What choice did she have? As she opened the door and slipped inside, the man's eyes locked with hers, a flicker of relief passing over his face. The engine started, and they sped off into the night, the world around them swallowed by the darkness. The man didn't speak immediately. The only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as they passed under trees lining the road. Suzanne felt a chill run through her, but her mind was still racing, trying to process everything. She glanced at him cautiously. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely audible, but the question had to be asked. The man looked straight ahead, his grip on the steering wheel tight. "My name is Jack," he said, his voice low and calm. "And I've been tracking Barry for a long time. He got involved with people who, they don't play by the rules. What he did, it wasn't just about money or power. He's been part of something far more dangerous than you realize." Suzanne's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What is this thing Barry was involved in?" Jack's eyes flicked briefly to her, then back to the road. "Trust me, Suzanne," he said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "You don't want to know everything. But I'll tell you this. Barry didn't have a choice. He got too deep, and now you're in danger because of it." Susan stared at him, her mind spinning with every word. Barry didn't have a choice? What does that mean? "Barry made some enemies," Jack continued. "Dangerous people, and they'll do whatever it takes to get to him, or anyone connected to him." Suzanne's heart sank. "I thought I knew him," she whispered, staring out the window, her gaze unfocused as the world outside blurred. How could he keep all this from me? How could he put me in this position? Jack's expression softened for a moment, but then he tightened his jaw. He didn't want you to know, Suzanne. That's the thing. He was trying to protect you, even if it meant keeping you in the dark. Suzanne shook her head in disbelief. Protect me? By lying to me? By keeping secrets this big? She could feel the anger rising inside her, the betrayal swelling in her chest like a tidal wave. Jack's voice was quieter now, as if he understood the storm of emotions she was feeling. He didn't want you to be involved. He didn't want you to get hurt. But you're already in too deep. And we don't have much time. Suzanne turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? We don't have much time? Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white. They know you're connected to him now, he said. And they'll be looking for you. We have to move fast. Get somewhere safe before they catch up to you. She looked at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Safe? Where can I go that's safe? There's a place, Jack said. A place where they won't find you. But it's not easy to get there. We'll need to lay low, stay off the radar. The urgency in his voice made her realize that this was real. She wasn't just running from her life. She was running from something much bigger, something that could swallow her whole. The road stretched on ahead, and Suzanne knew one thing for sure. Her life, as she had known it, was over. And this was only the beginning of a much darker journey. Suzanne sat in the car, the night pressing in on all sides, thick with the weight of the unknown. Jack's words echoed in her mind, sharp and relentless. Asterisk, we have to move fast. They'll find you, asterisk. Her pulse raced, each thumping beat reminding her how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. She glanced out the window, watching the dark landscape blur past, but her thoughts were far from the passing trees and distant lights. She couldn't stop thinking about Barry. She couldn't stop wondering if there was more to this. More that Jack wasn't telling her. She stole another glance at him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. He wasn't giving her the full story. She could tell. There was something more hidden beneath his calm, collected exterior. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. Why are you risking your life for someone you barely know? Jack's eyes flicked to her for just a moment, then back to the road. His jaw was tight, his features hard, as if trying to keep his emotions at bay. I'm not doing this for you, he said quietly. I'm doing this because of Barry. He's in way over his head, and he dragged you into it. Suzanne's throat tightened, the hurt and betrayal resurfacing. So, you're just here because of him? Not me. Jack didn't respond right away, his silence more telling than any words he could have said. Barry made a lot of mistakes, he said finally, his voice laced with regret. But he was trying to protect you. He wasn't the only one involved in this mess. There are people who want him gone. People who won't stop until they get what they want. Suzanne's chest tightened with the realization of how deep Barry's web went. She'd been so focused on the idea of Barry as her husband, her partner in life, that she hadn't realized the man she loved could have such dangerous secrets. How do you know all this? She asked, a thread of suspicion slipping into her voice. Who are you really, Jack? He didn't meet her eyes, but his grip on the wheel tightened even further. I told you. I've been tracking Barry for a long time, he replied shortly. I've seen what happens to people who cross the wrong lines. And now you're caught in it too. A sick feeling churned in Suzanne's stomach. If she hadn't opened that door to Jack, she would have never known the truth. But now, knowing that she was caught up in something she couldn't escape, something dark, dangerous, and relentless, made the terror rise in her chest. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She had to know. She had to understand what would happen next. There's a safe house, Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm of chaos that surrounded them. It's a place we can hide where no one can track us down. At least for now. Suzanne nodded, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. She had no choice but to trust Jack. For now. She was already in too deep, and there was no going back. As they continued to drive through the darkness, the silence between them felt heavy, oppressive. Suzanne couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was closing in from every side. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving from behind startled her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A set of headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. "Jack," she whispered, panic rising. "They're following us?" Jack's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his expression hardening. Without a word, he slammed his foot down on the gas, pushing the car into overdrive. The vehicle behind them was gaining speed, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Suzanne's breath caught in her chest. Were they after her? Were they after both of them? Jack swerved the car, weaving through the narrow roads, his focus razor-sharp. But the other car kept following, gaining on them with each turn. Suzanne could hear the screech of tires behind them, the sound of pursuit closing in. Her hands clenched the seat, her pulse racing. "Hold on!" Jack yelled, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Without warning, he veered off the road, sending the car barreling down a narrow dirt path. The tires skidded against the uneven ground, bouncing with each jarring turn. Suzanne's heart pounded in her chest as the sound of the pursuing car grew louder, the headlights flashing through the trees. "Jack, what are you doing?" she cried out, gripping the seat for dear life. "We're losing them," he growled. "Stay down." The car swerved again, barely avoiding a large boulder. Suzanne's stomach flipped, and she couldn't help but gasp, praying they wouldn't crash. But Jack didn't slow down. He pushed the pedal to the floor, throwing the car into a reckless speed that made Suzanne's chest tighten with fear. The headlights of the pursuing car were now almost gone, disappearing into the distance as Jack's driving proved too much for them to follow. They rounded a final bend, and then, as if by miracle, the headlights were gone. The car behind them had given up the chase. Jack eased off the accelerator, his breathing heavy, his face etched with tension. Suzanne sat back, her body trembling with adrenaline, relief flooding through her veins. They had made it. For now. But deep down, Suzanne knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The car slowed to a crawl, the only sound now the steady hum of the engine as Jack eased them further into the darkness. Suzanne's heart was still racing, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. She glanced over at Jack, who was focused on the road ahead, his jaw clenched, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. "Are we safe?" she finally asked, her voice shaky, though she tried to keep it steady. Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror one last time before he spoke. "For now," he said, his voice calm, but edged with exhaustion. "But we can't stop. Not yet. We need to get to the safe house." Suzanne nodded, but it didn't ease the knot in her stomach. They had barely escaped, and now, as the car sped through the desolate countryside, the silence between them felt suffocating. She needed to know more, needed to understand why this was happening, why Barry had kept so much from her. "What is this all about, Jack?" Susan asked, her voice softer this time, the fear creeping into her words. "You said Barry got too deep. But what does that even mean?" Jack's expression hardened, his gaze fixed on the road. "I told you, it's not just Barry. It's bigger than him. There are people who want power, control. Barry was a part of something that had far-reaching consequences, and now you're tangled in it too." Suzanne's mind spun with his words. She couldn't wrap her head around the fact that the man she had loved, the man she thought she knew, had been involved in something so dangerous. But what exactly was he involved in? Susan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack hesitated, glancing at her for a brief moment before focusing back on the road. Barry was involved in money laundering, drugs, weapons. It's a network of people who'll do anything to keep their operations under wraps. "Anything," he said, his voice dark with the weight of the words. Suzanne's breath caught in her throat. The man she had married was tangled in a web of crime and corruption, and she hadn't even known. How? How could he do that? How could he hide something like that from me? Her voice trembled as the betrayal and hurt surged within her. Jack's eyes softened for a moment, but then he steeled himself again. He didn't want you to know. He thought he could protect you, keep you safe. But it was too late. You got caught in it the moment you got close to him. The car dipped into a hollow, and the gravel beneath the tires rumbled ominously. making Suzanne's stomach lurch. They were in the middle of nowhere now, the landscape completely unfamiliar. The faint outlines of distant mountains loomed ahead, casting long shadows over the road. "What now?" Suzanne asked, feeling the weight of the silence closing in around her again. "Where are we going? What's the plan?" Jack didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the side, scanning the dark horizon, before he sighed deeply. "The plan is simple. Get you somewhere safe. Get you out of the spotlight. But that's only the first part. The next part, we'll figure out later." Suzanne swallowed hard, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, questions, and doubts. How could they figure out what was happening? How could she get her life back? All she knew was that everything was different now. She could never go back to the life she'd once known. Not after everything Barry had done, and the danger she was now caught up in. As the car continued down the narrow road, Suzanne's eyes scanned the darkness outside. The world felt so much larger than she had ever imagined. So much more dangerous. She glanced at Jack again. "I don't even know who to trust anymore," she said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of her confusion. Jack's gaze flicked over to her, his eyes hard, but filled with a sense of understanding. "You don't have to trust anyone but yourself right now. And me. I won't let anyone hurt you." Suzanne's heart ached at the simplicity of his promise. She wanted to believe him. She had to. But the truth of the situation was too overwhelming, too large to ignore. The life she had known was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was no telling how far the darkness would reach. With every mile they drove, the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavier on her shoulders. She looked out the window again, her thoughts clouded by fear and uncertainty. The road ahead was long, and the night felt endless. But Suzanne knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter what it took. The road stretched on, an endless ribbon of darkness cutting through the unknown. Every turn felt like it took them deeper into a world Susan wasn't sure she wanted to understand. She couldn't stop thinking about Barry. She couldn't stop wondering if he had been caught in something too big, something he couldn't control. Jack's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his focus unwavering. But Suzanne saw the way his jaw tightened every time they hit a bump or a curve. She could sense the tension in him, the weariness that seemed to bleed through his every movement. As the minutes stretched into hours, Suzanne's mind began to race again. They were headed to the safe house, but how safe could it be? How long before the people chasing them found them? Was this really the end of the line for her and Barry? Or was there a way out of this mess? She had so many questions, but none of them had answers. "I don't get it," Suzanne murmured, more to herself than to Jack. "How could Barry get involved in something so dangerous? I thought I knew him. I thought we had a life together. But now I'm starting to wonder if I ever really knew him at all." Jack's gaze flicked to her for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, as if weighing his words carefully before speaking. "Barry's a good man," he said, his voice low but firm. "But he made mistakes. Big ones. And now, well, now he's paying the price. You're paying the price." Suzanne's chest tightened at his words, but she knew there was some truth to them. Barry had always been protective, always careful with her, but now, everything she thought she knew was falling apart. "How could he keep this from me?" Suzanne's voice cracked, a sharp edge of pain slipping through. "How could he hide this life from me? Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he trust me enough to—" "Because he didn't want you involved," Jack interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "He didn't want you to be in danger. If he had told you, if you'd known, they would have gone after you too. They don't care who gets hurt in this. All they care about is what they want." Suzanne fell silent, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She tried to imagine what it must have been like for Barry, the fear, the secrecy. But nothing she imagined could explain how his life had turned into a trap he couldn't escape from. Hours passed in suffocating silence. The steady hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound, save for the occasional creak of the car's frame as it rocked over uneven terrain. Suzanne's eyelids felt heavy, but sleep wasn't something she could afford. Every moment of quiet seemed to build the pressure inside her chest, tightening it until she thought she might suffocate under the weight of her own fear. Finally, the car slowed, pulling off the road onto a narrow dirt path. The trees were dense here, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that shut out the last remnants of moonlight. Jack didn't speak as he steered the car down the trail, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement outside the vehicle. Susan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the night itself had eyes, that the darkness was closing in on them. The car eventually came to a stop in front of a weathered cabin, nestled deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar. It was the kind of place that could vanish into the surrounding forest if you weren't careful. "We're here," Jack said, his voice low. He cut the engine and pulled the keys from the ignition. Suzanne didn't move at first. She just stared at the cabin, her heart racing again. What if this wasn't safe? What if this was all part of the plan to lure her into a trap? "What now?" Suzanne asked, her voice small. Jack looked at her, his face hardening with resolve. "Now we wait. We'll stay here for a while, get some rest. But we can't let our guard down." "Not for a second." Suzanne nodded, but the dread she felt was suffocating. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. She didn't even know if she could trust Jack, despite everything he had done to help her. As Jack opened the door and stepped out into the night, Suzanne followed, her footsteps light but purposeful. She felt the weight of the situation settle around her, like a chain pulling her down into the earth. They entered the cabin, its air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The silence inside was heavy, oppressive, and as Susan glanced around, she couldn't help but feel like they were being watched by something unseen, something that had been waiting for them. Jack moved quickly, checking the windows and doors, securing everything. His every movement was deliberate, practiced, like someone who had done this 100 times before. Suzanne stayed in the center of the room, her eyes darting between the dark corners of the cabin, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't know how long they would stay here, or if it was really safe. But one thing was clear, the storm was coming, and Susan wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Days had passed since they arrived at the cabin. Time had become a blur, an endless stretch of waiting, of wondering if anyone was still out there, watching them. Susan could feel the walls closing in, the suffocating silence pressing down on her, the uncertainty gnawing at her insides. Jack had become more distant, retreating into himself with each passing hour. He was always checking the perimeter, making sure everything was secure, but there was a coldness to him now, a quiet desperation that Susan couldn't ignore. She had tried to talk to him, tried to understand the depth of the situation, but every time she asked a question, every time she sought comfort, his response was the same: stay focused. "We're not safe yet." But Suzanne knew. Deep down she knew. They had been followed, and the people chasing them weren't going to stop until they found them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Suzanne sat by the small, cracked window, watching the shadows stretch across the forest floor. Her mind wandered to Barry. What had he gotten himself into? Was he even alive? Was he still out there, fighting for his life? Or had he become just another casualty in this dangerous world they now inhabited? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a rustle in the trees outside. Suzanne's heart leapt into her throat, and she turned to Jack, who was sitting across the room, his eyes scanning the same darkening landscape. Jack's face hardened. "They're here," he muttered, his voice low but urgent. Suzanne's breath caught in her chest. The moment she had feared had arrived. They had found them. Jack quickly moved to the door, his hand resting on the handle as he gave Suzanne one last, meaningful look. "Stay quiet. Stay out of sight," he ordered, his voice harsh. Suzanne nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the endgame. There was no more running. There was no more hiding. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to face what would come. The door creaked open, and Jack slipped into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkness. Suzanne held her breath, pressing her back against the wall, praying the shadows would shield her, that the night would protect her. Outside, the rustling grew louder, followed by hushed voices, voices Suzanne didn't recognize. Her stomach twisted with fear as the sound of footsteps grew closer. She glanced out the window, but there was nothing to see, only the darkness. But she could feel it, the cold presence of danger closing in, just beyond her reach. Then, the door creaked again, and Suzanne's heart stopped. Was it Jack? A shadow moved across the threshold, and for a split second, Suzanne thought she saw him. But then the figure turned. It wasn't Jack. It was someone else, someone who had come for her. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and Suzanne realized that there was nowhere to run. This was it. She was trapped. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The fight she had tried to outrun, the danger she had hoped to escape, had finally caught up with her. And this time, there was no turning back. As the figure stepped fully into the cabin, Suzanne's mind raced, searching for an escape, but her body remained frozen, trapped in the suffocating grip of fear. The figure stepped closer, and in the dim light, Suzanne saw the flash of a gun in his hand. A chill ran down her spine, but before the figure could take another step, there was a sudden, loud crash from the back of the cabin, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Jack! He had come back. Without hesitation, Jack lunged at the intruder, his movements fast and practiced, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The two men grappled, their bodies crashing against the walls, each struggling for control. Suzanne's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to move, unable to help. It was a fight for survival, and in this moment, there was no room for mercy. Jack's grip tightened on the man's arm, forcing him to the ground, and for a split second, Suzanne saw the raw emotion in his eyes, the desperation, the rage. "Stay down!" Jack growled, his voice low and threatening. But the man didn't listen. With a snarl, the intruder pushed Jack away, reaching for the gun at his side. Suzanne's instincts kicked in. She couldn't stay silent anymore. With trembling hands, she grabbed the nearest object she could find, a broken chair leg, and hurled it at the intruder. The chair leg hit him square in the chest, knocking the gun from his hand. The man stumbled back, momentarily disoriented, but Jack didn't hesitate. In a flash, he lunged forward, pinning the man to the floor. The struggle continued, but Suzanne knew this was it, the turning point, the moment of truth. Finally, with one last violent movement, Jack overpowered the intruder, and the room fell silent. Suzanne's pulse raced as she watched the man, unconscious on the floor, but the danger was far from over. The fight wasn't finished yet. They were still being hunted. Jack stood over the man, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat. His eyes met Suzanne's, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the battle they were in. "We have to move," Jack said, his voice harsh, but resolute. "Now!" Suzanne nodded, her body trembling, but she knew there was no other choice. They had come too far to turn back. This was the beginning of the end. The cabin was eerily quiet now, the air thick with the aftermath of the struggle. Suzanne's pulse still hammered in her ears, and her hands trembled from the adrenaline. She couldn't believe what had just happened, the fight, the close call. But the man was down, and Jack had dealt with him. But the danger wasn't over. Jack stood over the intruder, his breath heavy, his expression unreadable. Suzanne watched him for a moment, her heart pounding, but a part of her knew what was coming. They couldn't stay here anymore. The safe house had never truly been safe. The walls were closing in, and they had to leave before someone else came for them. "Is he?" Suzanne started to ask, her voice unsure, but Jack cut her off. "He's not dead," Jack replied, his voice sharp, "but he won't be getting up anytime soon." Suzanne nodded, but her thoughts were scattered. She had never imagined her life would come to this. Being hunted, running from something bigger than she could comprehend. And yet, here she was, caught in the web of a life she didn't ask for, a life she never could have prepared for. "What now?" Suzanne asked quietly, though she knew the answer. There was no more hiding, no more waiting. Jack looked around the room one last time before heading toward the door. "We move. It's time to end this." Suzanne followed him, her footsteps hesitant but determined. They stepped out into the cold night air, and for the first time in what felt like days, Suzanne could finally breathe. The weight of their immediate danger still hung over them, but in that moment, she felt a strange sense of clarity. They had made it this far, and they could make it further. As they walked away from the cabin, Jack's hand on the small of her back was reassuring. It was as if he had become her anchor, the one constant in a storm of uncertainty. Suzanne didn't know where they were headed next, or what would happen once they got there, but she knew one thing. They were in this together. In the distance, she saw the faint outline of a road. They weren't far from the next part of the plan, whatever that was. But for now, they just had to keep moving. The world outside was vast and unforgiving, but Suzanne had found something she hadn't realized she'd lost: hope. And with that hope came the strength to keep going. They weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. As the dark forest swallowed them whole, Suzanne realized that the fight was just beginning.